Hello and welcome back to my Legion class review series where I level up every class in the game, get them to 110, get them geared, play every spec, and then share my thoughts with you. Today I'm going to be covering the Shaman, and really I've got a lot to say about this one, so let's just jump right into it. Alright, Elemental, so this is our caster spec. It's all designed around using your mastery over the elements to hurl various forms of nasty things at your enemies, and overall, it's a hell of a lot of fun. Class Fantasy is going to be quite the running theme throughout this video because it's something that Blizzard have essentially nailed with most of the Shaman specs. Elemental has big, chunky projectiles. It's the kind of thing that really my hunter is envious of. Their sound effects are pretty damn meaty as well, and it really just all ties together quite nicely to make a cohesive spec that feels quite good to play from the kind of visual and gameplay feel perspective. At its core though, this is just another variation of your standard caster archetype, so then the question is this a good take on that caster formula? And overall, yeah, I've got to say it is. At the core, you do have your rather, solid basic rotation, but where it starts to come into its own is when you select a few particular talents, and then when you take Maelstrom Generation and its interplay with the Elemental Overload mechanic, which is basically just multi-strike from Warlords of Draenor, like whenever you take that into account. Basically the way it works is that many of your core abilities can proc a second, smaller version of themselves, which will then generate a Maelstrom itself, which it kind of gives you enough unpredictability in how the gameplay sort of feels that there's something to react to, but it's not so much RNG that it starts to get really annoying. You also do get some really nice utility, of course. You've got your Ghost Wolf, you've got a few useful totems like your Earth Grab, Wind Rush, and Lightning Surge, which will slow enemies, speed up allies, or stun enemies. All of those are dead handy. The other totems, unfortunately, have just been put into a single talent, which you just plonk down around you. It gives you a few buffs. Now, from a totem perspective, not that interesting, but yeah, I guess it does have some fun effects on the rotation. I'd say overall, my largest criticism is they haven't really been able to find compelling totem-based gameplay with the Elemental Shaman, and that could be its more unique thing. Back when totem management was needed in the game, it was often pretty fiddly to manage, so they started making, mechanics to help you move your totems, and it all just got a little bit contrived. It does seem like they've kind of given up on totems being super important for Elemental, and they've instead focused on them as casters. Thankfully, though, that's actually worked out quite well. Okay, so how does it work? Well, much of your damage comes from the interplay of two abilities, Lava Burst and Flame Shock. Flame Shock is a damage over time spell, so you want to keep that applied to your enemies. Then Lava Burst will always crit if it hits a Flame Shocked enemy, and then Flame Shock ticks have a 10% chance to proc Lava Surge, which will instantly refresh the cooldown of Lava Burst, which is otherwise 8 seconds. And on top of that, most players use a talent called Echo of the Elements, which gives your Lava Burst 2 charges, so Lava Surge will instead just give you an extra charge. Now that overall does sort of increase the pace of gameplay, and it's pretty fun. Now, you do have filler, of course, and that is Lightning Bolt in single target or Chain Lightning in AoE. These both do some damage and generate a resource called Maelstrom, which, yeah, I guess I've alluded to it, I should probably talk about it now. Maelstrom is generated by Lava Burst, Lightning Bolt, and Chain Lightning, and it's mainly used by 3 abilities, Flame Shock, Earth Shock, and Earthquake. Now, Flame Shock can consume up to 20 Maelstrom in order to, I believe, double its duration. Then Earth Shock is your main single target dump of Maelstrom. Basically, it deals a really large amount of damage, well, potentially. Basically, it does more damage based on how many Maelstrom it uses, and it can use up to 100. So the idea is, you're carrying out your rotation, you are filling up your Maelstrom bar, and then unleashing it via Earth Shocks. Now, this does create quite a nice secondary rhythm in the rotation, which I really do appreciate. Earthquake then is used in AoE. Basically, it does a bunch of damage to enemies in an area over its duration, and you want to keep that going for your AoE scenarios. Now, what makes it all more interesting to me is Elemental Blast. This is a talented ability with a 12-second cooldown. It does just a load of damage, right? But it can then give you, well, it does give you, temporary buffs to your secondary stats. The buff that you get lasts for 10 seconds, so ideally you want to time everything so that you're doing your important abilities during buff uptime. you also want to use Elemental Blast before, say, a big cooldown like Ascendance. Now, it isn't a massively complex bit of gameplay, but that buff management it's a sort of a nice little layer to have, I suppose. Now, as I mentioned, okay, the Mastery is Elemental Overload. So you've got around a 20% chance for your abilities to fire off twice, with the second one doing 75% damage and also giving you Maelstrom. Now, I love how this interacts with Elemental Blast. It basically works that the second smaller Elemental Blast will still give you a buff, which is pretty sweet. So then what happens, of course, is the more mastery you have, the more often this effect happens, which leads to significantly higher Maelstrom generation, and overall, it's just a really cool thing. This can lead to a comical amount of spell effects flying out of your character, which is, well, simply put, just really satisfying. I'd definitely say, though, that this spec is one that gets more fun as you gear up. Now, that is almost always the case with these specs, but, you know, your general pace increases because of the haste, but also you get way more Maelstrom due to Elemental Overload and, you know, your Mastery. Now, this is even more compounded by, say, talenting to Elemental Blast, or using your Totem Mastery to give you sort of like more little buffs and effects, which will increase the pace of the spec. They've also got a number of very solid talent builds, which actually trade places based on the type of boss fight you're doing, and each of them does change up the gameplay a little bit, so I think it's definitely nice to have that choice in there. I'd say that this spec can be a little bit dull at the lower gear levels, but it really does scale up nicely indeed. I do actually think this is my favorite of the two Shaman DPS specs, which is really a complete surprise because I went in expecting to prefer Enhancement. Okay, Enhancement. So while I do prefer Elemental, that isn't to say that I don't like Enhancement. I actually kind of love it. It's really, really good. Once again, the class fantasy, of course, has been nailed by the art and sound teams. Always nice to see. Enhancement is the melee counterpart to Elemental, so it combines much of that fast-paced melee gameplay with what we're used to with a kind of, you know, like a layer of elemental magic and all of that stuff. It's got some great procs as well, which are implemented in such a way that they create a really good amount of gameplay quite naturally. The spec itself is designed around you buffing up your weapon, managing your Maelstrom generation, balancing buffs, and then, you know, sort of based on your build, managing the various different buffs and cooldowns that you've got access to. It's pretty damn satisfying overall, and it's also a hell of a lot of fun when it comes to the AoE situations. Now, Maelstrom is your main resource. It's more of a builder-spender spec than, say, Elemental is, in that you do quite a lot more with your Maelstrom here. So it's generated mainly via Rockbiter. This has no cooldown, it's got a short range, and it can be talented to give you a buff whenever you use it. So much of the gameplay surrounds maintaining uptime of that buff, and then ensuring you have enough Maelstrom to execute the rest of your rotation. And there's another talent, which is just a slightly different variation of it. So yeah, you've got your basic one sort of button, which is for generation. Then auto attacks will also generate Maelstrom, as do your Wind Fury attacks. What is Wind Fury? Well, this is one of the more traditionally Shaman things. Wind Fury is a passive effect that gives your main hand attacks a 20% chance to trigger 2 more times. These extra attacks will also generate Maelstrom, so you get quite a lot of generation there. We then need to cover Flame Tongue. This is a buff that you just need to maintain in your weapon, and it just causes your weapons to deal additional fire damage. And yeah, it's pretty much something that you always want to have active. Okay, so now that we're generating resources, let's cover how we actually spend them. So, Storm Strike is your big heavy hitter. It has a 16-second cooldown that is reduced by haste, and is often, it's just your main source of damage. It really hits like a truck. Now, don't let that long cooldown scare you. Stormbringer is a passive effect that will give both main hand attacks a 5% chance to reset the cooldown of Storm Strike, and reduce the next Storm Strike cost by 50%. Storm Strike can then, of course, itself proc Stormbringer, which gives you these sort of chains of attacks that are very nice. I've got the Tempest talent, which causes Stormbringer to affect the next 2 Storm Strikes, which again does increase the pace of gameplay of the spec. The main Maelstrom dump then, for not doing your Storm Strikes, is Lava Lash. It's got no cooldown and is basically there just to prevent you from capping Maelstrom. Now, that really is the core rotation, but there's a lot more to it than that. So for AoE, we actually want to throw in something called Crash Lightning into the mix. This does damage in front of you, and it will empower your Storm Strike and Lava Lash to do extra damage to enemies in front of you if you hit more than 2 targets. And even better, every hit from it technically counts as a main hand, so it can also proc Stormbringer, which leads to madness in AoE scenarios and is really fun. I guess just the extra bit of depth there is that in non-AoE, or non-sort of primarily AoE situations, you can still use it to hit 2 targets to get the buff. And overall, just it sort of using this just turns you into an AoE powerhouse, and it really makes the just the pace of some of the gameplay really fun. Now I'm going to cover a few of the cooler talents before we move on. I ended up using the Tempest talent for the most part, though Overcharge is another option that adds a fun mechanic. It's also best before you get into like having a 4-piece from Nighthold. Basically, it causes lightning bolt to consume up to 40 Maelstrom to do extra damage on a cooldown. This adds another really cool layer of management to the gameplay that I really like. There's another one called Fury of Air. I think it's a pretty cool option. It spends 3 Maelstrom per second to do a constant AoE around your character, so you do need to like take that into account with your Maelstrom management, but overall I do think it is a pretty cool effect, and it's one that's quite comfortable to use, and yeah, I guess it kind of just does look cool. There's also Doom Winds. This thing's really cool. So it's your artifact weapon ability. It causes all your auto attacks to trigger a Wind Fury, and it then increases Wind Fury damage by 200%. So first, it gives you loads of Maelstrom, but secondly, your Storm Strikes can Wind Fury. So yeah, that really does make that 200% damage buff kind of massive. Now, combine this effect with all of your buffs and Stormbringer, and you can line it up so that you have the 6 seconds of Doom Winds with loads of Stormbringer procs, and it's just insanity. Really, this spec is just about maximizing the effects of all of these mechanics, having uptime of all your buffs, and then setting up situations where you're able to best benefit from the baked-in randomness of effects like Stormbringer. A really core part of the rotation just boils down to keeping a decently high amount of Maelstrom so that you can easily exploit the times when the procs do go in your favor with things like Stormbreaker. I then really love stuff like the extra gameplay with Crash Lightning as well, and yeah, I think it's great. Sadly, I do not have the tier 19 4-piece or any spec-specific legendaries. My streak of having Empirdas or Sefus on nearly all characters has just seemed to continue once again. Okay, Restoration. This is a really bizarre one for me to cover. I rarely heal, but I had a complete blast with Resto. Now, prior to this, I had healed with a Holy Paladin for a tiny part of Wrath, and then casually played a Resto Druid for parts of Warlords of Draenor. So, healing in this Shaman was really quite new to me indeed, and that said, I really, overall, I just really enjoyed learning their toolkit and that whole process. And it seems like, from what I've read at least, they're a very valuable healer to have in a raid environment, because of just some of the strengths of their toolkit. So, like all healers, they have or like most healers anyway, you've got your slow, efficient heal and your fast, inefficient heal. And then much of the gameplay involves basically choosing the right tool for the job, ensuring that you're keeping everyone alive without burning through your mana pool. Now, what I like about the Resto Shaman is that it's got a few effects which make these core kind of bread and butter spells more interesting to use. Okay, so Healing Wave is your slow to cast, mana efficient spell. Then Healing Surge is your fast to cast yet, less mana efficient spell. Simple enough, really. We then have Riptide, so this is an instant heal that then does a heal over time on your target. So it felt quite natural to me, of course, after playing a Resto Druid. Now, what I love here is there's an effect called Tidal Wave. Using Riptide will give you a stack of Tidal Wave, and you can have a maximum of 2 stacks of Tidal Wave. Now, Tidal Wave will either speed up the cast time of Healing Wave or increase the crit chance of Healing Surge. So, as much as possible, you want to be casting Wave or Surge under the Tidal Wave effect so that you're getting more throughput and, of course, more mana efficiency, because it's really just enhancing the power of your toolkit. Okay, so you have Riptide at everyone, you're using your Tidal Wave stacks to efficiently respond to incoming damage. What next? Well, we've got a few other things. We've got Healing Rain. It's that blue circle you may have stood in at some point. Basically, it heals everyone inside it. Though in smaller situations like dungeons, I think really Healing Stream Totem is kind of doing more of the work there. Now, Healing Stream Totem is a 30-second cooldown with a 15-second duration. Basically, it smart heals people within 40 yards around it, super mana efficient. If there are some AoE worries, you can throw that down, a few chain heals, and you should pretty much be good. Now, as you get more and more pressured, you'll be using more of your globals for tidal waved healing surges rather than healing waves, and you'll of course be filling far fewer globals with your damaging abilities. Now, after playing many really rotational classes, one thing that is just really refreshing playing a healer is it's less about following a rotation or priority system, and it's more about thinking around your toolkit, the situation at hand, and the amount of mana that you've got available to you. So, really, much of my talents and stuff like that, at least initially, were kind of, it was just based off like playstyle and game feel, and that was kind of interesting and a little bit different from some of the more super cookie cutter things with DPS. But let's get back to the mechanics though. So we have a bunch of great cooldowns. We've got Healing Tide Totem, 3-minute cooldown, drops the totem, heals allies within 40 yards every 2 seconds, and that's it. It's awesome. It's foolproof. If stuff gets bad, use it, things will get better. Not super involved as far as the gameplay, but it's nice having this kind of oh shit button that you can smash if things get scary. Now, Spirit Link Totem is another pretty damn cool one, and it's certainly different from anything that I'd used before. So a totem drops on a location that you select, and it then redistributes people's health so that they're at the same overall percentage, and it will then decrease their damage taken by 10%. So if some, like one person or, a group of people are kind of near death, but some of them have a little bit more health, the near death player will be brought back up quickly, of course at the expense of the players with more health. Now, it seems like it's maybe possible to mess up in a few situations with that, but it's a really cool mechanic for reducing the chance of a player in an area just kind of being globaled, maybe if they made a mistake or something like that. We do have a few other really cool abilities, but that's most of the interesting stuff for me. Really, once you get used to the toolkit, it's kind of just a matter of paying attention to what's going on, like in the room around you. So, you're using your Lightning Surge totem to prevent incoming damage by stunning mobs. You're purging stuff from people. You are helping out, with a little bit of the damage wherever you can. I think it's just a really fun, different type of gameplay. Now, UI-wise, I used Grid 2, and then I used Click to manage my mouse over stuff, but you can totally do that just with normal macros without an add-on. Even if you don't plan to main a healer, though, I think it's really worth spending some time on one. It gives you a great insight into how the overall game works, and I think it really does help you become a better player in a team environment, because you kind of get what's going on with your healer friends. Now, the downside of playing healer, of course, is you don't have a massive impact unless shit's hit the fan. So a good tank can really up the pace of gameplay and increase the damage of the team by forming death balls so people can cleave. DPS, of course, can just, DPS real hard, but a healer, you're just chilling out, sitting back, keeping everyone alive. So there's a bit of a downside there, but I do think it's a more unique form of gameplay that's casually very enjoyable to me. If I was to go back into full-time raiding, I think I'd be going DPS though, because it just does fit how I play better, but having a healer available to me to play if I feel like it is definitely something that I really like, and my time with Restoration was really enjoyable. So overall, I think the big positive here is variety. You have a great melee spec, a great range spec, and a great healer spec. This gives you loads of flexibility in how you play the game. Each spec feels different and is very well designed. Unlike, say, the Warrior, I'd be happy to play any of these, really, for an extended duration of time. The largest negative is, they can be a bit slow at the lower gear levels, but that problem, it's fixed in an evening, so not really much of an issue. Leveling on them wasn't great, I'll admit that, but once again, not a massive amount of your time is spent leveling up characters these days, so I wouldn't worry about it. Utility-wise, they're just great. Loads of utility totems, things like Feral Lunge, Gust of Wind, Spirit Wolf, all that stuff helps you move around quickly. They just feel really fun and well-rounded with a great toolkit, and to conclude, I suppose, this is another really solid entry to the game in my book anyway, even though I'm sure I have a lot to learn in terms of, especially with Restoration. I'm really enjoying that process with the Shaman. There's some nice hidden depths and, little things min-maxing with each spec, and I'm especially enjoying my first foray into healing in basically almost a year. Now, that's it for the Shaman. Overall, massive thumbs up. This video did take a little bit longer than planned, though. I had wanted to cover the Rogue, but upon realizing that basically 7.2.5 has loads of changes, I decided to wait, so I leveled up the Shaman to 110 instead. I'm thinking of doing the Death Knight next, and then maybe the Rogue as soon as 7.2.5 comes out, but let me know what your thoughts on that are. So that's it for this entry to my Legion class review series. Thank you very much for watching, especially if you've managed to make it this far, and massive thanks to everyone on Patreon. They've really helped to sort of up things with the channel, bring on an editor so I can spend more time doing in-depth videos like this. But that's it for the video, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.